There are now over 10,000 games tagged as Roguelite on Steam, and roguelite mechanics and design ideas have exerted a wide influence in mainstream gaming. Several big-budget franchises have added roguelite modes to their games, from Assassin's Creed Valhalla Forgotten Saga, to Hitman's Freelancer mode, Far Cry's Vast Insanity DLC, God of War Ragnarok Valhalla, The Last of Us No Return, and the massively underrated Prey Mooncrash. Despite being a relatively niche product, roguelites are a compelling and culturally significant type of game, and their mechanics and gameplay ideas are becoming increasingly widespread. A lot of my research on games so far has been about roguelikes and roguelites. I've done journal articles on Darkest Dungeon, Dwarf Fortress, and the Berlin interpretation of roguelikes. But over the past couple of years, working with a fantastic team of other researchers, I've been putting together a book about roguelites, a collection of essays which examine roguelites from various academic perspectives. It's going to be called The Rise of the Roguelite. The book's due for release at the end of March 2025 with CRC Press of the Taylor and Francis Publishing Group. So I thought I'd do a video or two about it on the channel, tell you a little bit about what's in it. But before we talk about what's in a book about roguelite games, I thought it would be good to talk a bit about what they actually are. What exactly is a roguelite? This is a difficult question to answer for several reasons. For anyone who's never heard of it, the term roguelite probably seems like quite a strange name for a video game genre. If you compare it with others like first-person shooter, beat-em-up, strategy, or puzzle, these labels immediately tell newcomers what to expect. Purely based on the meanings of the words in them, you know you'll be doing a lot of shooting, beating people up, strategizing, or solving puzzles. You can't work out any of that from the word roguelite. Things are made even more complicated by the fact that many roguelites differ massively from one another, and borrow techniques from many different genres of video game. There are first and third person shooter roguelites, card game roguelites, slot machine roguelites, billiard roguelites, tower defense roguelites, strategy roguelites, and so on. It's difficult to specify what unites them all. What do a fast-paced action RPG like Hades and a cerebral deck builder like Balatro have in common with each other? Or the cartoony platforming of Spelunky and the grotesque horror of The Binding of Isaac? Well, despite their stark differences in content, tone, theme, and gameplay experience, these games can all be called roguelites because of their shared historical influences, gameplay mechanics, and design philosophy. Perhaps their shared historical influence is where we should begin. The word roguelite carries a lot of baggage from the history of gaming because it's derived from one of the oldest, most enduringly popular and influential video game genres ever, the roguelike. Now, I did a previous video about the history of the roguelike genre, so if you want to see this discussed in more detail, by all means go watch that. But I'll keep things a bit briefer for today. Roguelike games are games named for their similarity to and their being influenced by the game Rogue, an early classic of video game history originally released in 1980, which became popular in American university computer labs throughout the early 80s. The player's challenge in Rogue is to traverse the dungeons of doom, densely populated with monsters, to retrieve the Amulet of Yendor and escape with it. While this sounds simple enough, achieving it is not, and requires a lot of learning and tactical thinking. Each move made in the game takes one turn, and when the player takes a turn, so does everything else in the game world. The player has as much time to think in between moves as they desire, which is paramount because one mistake could spell death, meaning the player starts again from scratch from the beginning. No checkpoints, no reloading a previous save. When you're dead, you're dead. On top of all that, the nature of many of the items you pick up on your journey are unknown to you until you use them or find some other way to identify them. That potion you just found could give you that health boost you so desperately need, or it could poison you, blind you, or God knows what else. The creators of Rogue said they wanted to make an infinitely replayable game that they could be surprised by, even though they were the ones that created it. To achieve this, they used what was arguably their masterstroke, maybe the single most influential mechanic in Rogue's design: procedural environment generation. Rather than design full levels from scratch, the developers programmed the game environment to be randomly generated on each playthrough, meaning the map layout and the appearance of items and enemies would all be different every time you played it. Rogue wasn't the first game to ever do this. This was actually a game called Beneath Apple Manor, but the creators of these two games appeared to have no knowledge of each other, and Rogue is the game that caught on in the public imagination, which subsequent Roguelikes were imitating, and which would give its name to the genre. Rogue was so well crafted, with so many good ideas in it, that it continues to be imitated to this day, and still exerts a tangible influence on video game design 4 decades later. Roguelites are the most recent chapter in this history, but already a couple of years after Rogue was released, people were copying and expanding on its formula, with games like Hack and Moria, and later some of the most important roguelikes, like NetHack, Angband, Dungeon Crawl Stone Soup, and ADOM Ancient Domains of Mystery. All these games involve very different experiences, even though they share a certain formula which remains relatively constant. At the 2008 Roguelike Development Conference in Berlin, a group comprised of roguelike developers and fans tried to pin down exactly what this formula was. The result, what's come to be known as the Berlin interpretation, lists 9 high-value and 6 low-value factors that can be used to determine how roguelike a game is, and was the source of a great deal of controversy and criticism in the roguelike community. The creators of the interpretation said that it wasn't their intention to place constraints on developers or games, but many in the community felt that if such a list was actually followed, it would lead to a constrained, repetitive and boring genre, which the roguelike genre isn't. Even if you look at some modern examples like Brogue, Cogmind, Rift Wizard or Caves of Cud, these are all very different games, even if they share a lot of the same underlying commonalities in their design. One of the most famous criticisms of the interpretation came from the roguelike developer Darren Gray in a post called Screw the Berlin Interpretation, which I think he's now deleted. But in it, Gray likened the interpretation to an ingredients list, akin to saying that the definition of cake is flour, eggs, butter and sugar. While all these things are important ingredients of cake, this definition misses out that special something that happens when they're combined, and the many delicious, varied recipes which can result from such a combination. Despite the antipathy towards the Berlin interpretation, it's still a good place to start when discussing the important features of roguelikes, and an excellent place to start for discussing how later Roguelite games experiment with roguelike ideas. It might read like a constraining list of rules, but to be fair to it, some of the things it lists do feature in basically every traditional roguelike ever made, and without them, they would be fundamentally different games with fundamentally different experiences. This is not true of every item in the interpretation, but it does get at least some of them right. So the high value factors are random environment generation, permadeath, turn-based gameplay, grid-based layout, non-modal gameplay, complexity, resource management, hack and slash gameplay, and exploration and discovery. And the low value factors are single player character, monsters must be similar to players, tactical challenge, ASCII display, dungeons, and showing the numbers of hit points and damage and armour and things like that. Now, in defence of the interpretation, several of the high value factors in it do seem to be essential features of traditional roguelikes, especially random generation, permadeath, turn-based gameplay, and complexity. If you were to remove any of these features from the canonical examples of roguelikes, you would fundamentally change the experience of the game. However, it's understandable that this list has attracted criticism from the roguelike community, because there are some things about it that make little sense. For instance, whether a game has ASCII graphics or not tells us nothing about what type of game it is. Games of many genres could use ASCII graphics, so even including it as a low value factor is a questionable move. Also, there is an argument to be made that tactical challenge is a high value factor rather than a low value one. People play roguelikes for this kind of challenge. Being set in a dungeon also doesn't justify being included as a high or low value factor, A game could have any setting and potentially still be a roguelike. And this is all before we get to the more substantial criticisms about the nature of the list itself, whether it's necessary or useful, or whether, despite its intentions, it does place unnecessary constraints on developers and their games. To wade into all of that in detail here would take us too far off track, but knowing what the Berlin interpretation involves gives us a good starting point for talking about roguelites, what kind of games they are, their connection to roguelikes, and the kind of experimentations they make with roguelike mechanics. The term roguelite emerged in gaming discourse because there was sufficient need to distinguish this recent wave of games from the older ones that directly inspired them, while still acknowledging the clear influence of one on the other. Roguelites differ from roguelikes in significant ways, and creatively experiment with their mechanics, but there are discernible connections between them, and they have a certain feel that links them. But what kind of games are roguelites exactly? What kinds of experimentation do they make with roguelike mechanics? On these questions, I think a video from the YouTube channel Design Doc called The Evolution of Roguelike Design responds quite well. Design Doc invites us to think of the items in the Berlin interpretation as kind of like chords in music. The same chord can be in dozens of hit songs, each of them with their own feel, but they all use the same basic tool to get there. They're all unique paths using the same stepping stone. It's maybe what's a little strange about the Berlin interpretation. I don't think it's useful to stick to a rigid definition. It's helpful when you want to study the elements of a design, but sticking to it too closely will just get you cookie-cutter reskins of classics. If you start thinking of a roguelike as a mosaic of elements instead of a monolith, you open up dozens of new possibilities, and really good spin-off games that still have a core that's recognisable as inspired by classic roguelike design. If we think of the Berlin interpretation as being like the sheet music of Beethoven's Ninth, for instance, following that formula will result in a performance of the Ninth, but there are still different ways of playing it. Between various performances, certain parts could be emphasised or de-emphasised, made louder or quieter, faster or slower, played on a different number of instruments using a different conductor, etc. But the performance would still be a performance of the Ninth, with all of its constituent parts present, following its notes, chords, and changes according to the original sheet music. Many traditional roguelikes of the 80s and 90s follow the schema of the Berlin interpretation relatively closely, and the results are distinctly recognisable as examples of that formula, as performances of the original composition. But musicians can be inspired by a piece of music in many ways. Rather than following a piece closely and giving an interpretation of the whole thing, a musician could borrow a chord or two, a sequence of notes, a key, a technique, or a combination of these things, and create something else entirely. Roguelites are working from the same schema as roguelikes, but are much more experimental with it, and they don't attempt to follow it closely. Some aspects of the Berlin interpretation that would be crucial for roguelikes are often left out entirely or changed completely in roguelites, while other elements are added. This can range from ditching ASCII graphics to getting rid of a grid-based system, turn-based combat, being set in a dungeon, and beyond. This results in roguelites having very different experiences that nonetheless bear the stamp of their historical origin, in much the same way that the influence of classical music can be felt in symphonic metal or the blues in rock. Part of the roguelite's appeal is its flexibility, in that roguelike developers can freely and excitingly blend other gaming genres with roguelike mechanics. Whether it's real-time action, strategy, platforming, Metroidvania, horde survival, or even construction and management simulation, part of the reason for the roguelite's popularity surely stems from the fact that you could potentially make a roguelite game out of anything. By incorporating tropes from different genres and blending them with roguelike mechanics, roguelites can appeal to a wide variety of gamers, and the possibilities for experimentation are massive. A particularly popular change that roguelites make to the roguelike formula is to experiment with turn-based gameplay. Many roguelites drop it completely in favour of real-time combat, whilst retaining other important features like random generation, permadeath, complexity, tactical design, resource management, or hack and slash, or exploration, and so on. High-profile examples of roguelites that do this would include The Binding of Isaac, Hades, Dead Cells, Enter the Gungeon, Rogue Legacy 1 and 2, Cult of the Lamb, and many others. Spelunky, on the other hand, drops turn-based gameplay and instead wraps roguelike mechanics into a fast-paced, difficult platforming game. Other roguelites retain turn-based gameplay, but give the turns a different meaning. In Slay the Spire, turns become moves in a card game, with the player building an increasingly strong deck the further they progress. Spire basically launched an entire subgenre all of its own, the roguelite deck builder, which has become increasingly popular in recent years with games like Inscription, Monster Train, Cobalt Core, Balatro, and many others. Into the Breach, on the other hand, features an almost chess-like turn-based strategy in which the player controls robotic machinery, each with different available moves, and then uses them to fight alien hordes. Both Spire and Breach feature randomized elements, permadeath, complexity, and so on. The absolutely bizarre Crypt of the Necrodancer replaces turns with beats in a piece of music, and the player must move around the dungeon whilst keeping time with the music. However, apart from that, Necrodancer is structured much like a traditional roguelike, and even includes a roguelike mode. Shotgun King is a chess-themed roguelite that's exactly what it sounds like. You're the king, and you've got a shotgun. Another common change roguelites make to the roguelike formula is that they relax the permadeath mechanic, tending to make it much more forgiving by implementing some form of what's known as metaprogression. In a roguelike, when you die, you restart from scratch, having gained nothing to take into your next attempt. But in many roguelites, there is the opportunity to unlock upgrades that carry over in between runs. In some games, this means being able to upgrade your character and make them stronger, as in Hades and Rogue Legacy, while in others, it means unlocking more items like weapons and upgrades that can potentially show up in future runs, as in Enter the Dungeon or Dead Cells. Metaprogression is a popular design choice in roguelites, and is sometimes cited as the exact thing that differentiates them from roguelikes. There has been a fair amount of debate about the precise differences between roguelites and roguelikes, and perhaps there isn't only one thing that differentiates them. There's also been debate about which is better, but given the staggering variety available in both roguelikes and roguelites, and in what kind of gaming preferences people like and dislike, surely this is a matter of personal preference. It is true, however, that the term roguelite almost sounds disparaging, as though referring to a somehow inferior, less authentic product. It's understandable why the name caught on. It's almost identical to roguelike, which immediately indicates the connection between the two. And in some respects, roguelites are light on certain things that roguelikes have in abundance. Roguelites tend not to be as immensely complex and impenetrable to new players, or requiring as much studying or memorising as classic roguelikes like NetHack. The familiar joke about NetHack is that you need a degree to play it. Roguelites are usually easy to pick up and play, whereas the learning curve for roguelikes is much steeper. A run in a roguelite can be completed usually in a short burst of between 20 minutes and an hour. A run in some roguelikes, however, can take multiple days. There is often, though certainly not always, less of a focus on strategic thinking in roguelites. Permadeath is almost always softened somehow in roguelites, but never in roguelikes. Hades, for instance, has an optional Death Defiance mechanic, which gives the player extra lives for that run. Roguelites often have tutorials that guide you step by step through the mechanics of the game. Roguelikes rarely feature guided tutorials, instead featuring long help sections the player must study for themselves. In a lot of ways, roguelikes simply are more demanding than roguelites. In some respects, roguelikes expect more out of you, and for many that is part of their curious charm. But what roguelites may lack in these areas compared to roguelikes they more than make up for in others. Roguelites tend to be easier experiences to get into, and in the areas where they're less demanding than traditional roguelikes, it can arguably be a good thing that they are less demanding. Ideally, you shouldn't need to study and research a game or play it 100 times just to be able to know what you're doing in it. For some, that's a satisfying aspect of the experience, but roguelike mechanics and ideas can be introduced to a wider audience without this being a requirement. Also, what roguelites sacrifice in depth and technical complexity, they make up for by introducing new forms of challenge and gameplay experiences, which require different ways of thinking and acting. Real-time combat is a different challenge to the intense turn-based strategizing of traditional roguelikes, but it can be just as difficult to master. Beating Dead Cells on the highest difficulty is just as challenging as beating any traditional roguelike, but it's a completely different experience, which appeals to a different kind of audience, with different skills and gameplay preferences. The fact that roguelites are creatively experimenting with them in such prolific and open ways is bringing more exposure to the roguelike genre than arguably since its inception, and many players are being introduced to roguelikes via Roguelites. For newcomers and long-time fans alike, roguelites have much to offer players and designers of various stripes. They're an absolutely fascinating mode of game design, and I think will continue to be for a while to come. Thank you so much for watching this video. Do like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this. Do leave us a comment, as always, if you'd like to let us know what you think. And we'll return to the subject of roguelites in some videos upcoming on the channel. So do stay tuned for that, and all the best and see you next time.